Sounds great. Oh yeah, that's good. Well, I knew what part you were. Yeah. That's always good.
Because we woke her up from a nap.
So I made 30 copies of the thing, and I'm glad that we ran out. That's a good problem to have. I have 2 up here. Honestly, like if you could, I think if we could just share, like that would be beneficial. Like if we have a couple of one.
You guys need an extra one?
No.
You guys good?
Anyone need an extra? Anyone down one?
Okay. If there are 10 verses to a song, we will sing all 10 verses. Yeah, no, the whole thing, like, he loved it. So there were a couple of, like, there was that one song that had 10 verses. So we sang all of them. And it was even like, they have a verse in the bulletin. And like, we get through, like, verse 10. So it'll be like, and we're like, oh, there's like, there's more. Like the bulletin, 30
Like today's all same thing, so like okay, we're all the same page, like verses, change it up.
Yeah, otherwise you just probably like zone out and then you're like, oh wait, what verse am I on?
And if there's not a lot of conversation, you're like, oh, so I would always put S's.
Yeah.
What day so far? Sometimes you see one person.
All right, we are going to get going.
Otherwise I won't know what to end.
We have one extra packet. Does anybody need a packet?
Great, no, we can go get it.
All right, if you don't know who I am, you haven't been around for the last 10 weeks or so. I'm Pastor Colby. I'm leading this Bible study on Jeremiah. Why don't we get going with a word of prayer first? So, Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for everybody here. Please open our hearts and our minds to your word as we study Jeremiah, your blessed prophet. Be with us all today and the rest of the week and always. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so Steve said to me, Colby, you have to do a Bible study. Great. It has to be Old Testament. Great. Okay, I actually love the Old Testament. That's good for me. And then he said, pick any book you want. So I was like, well, I could do Genesis, but I've got 6 weeks. I can do Exodus, but I've got 6 weeks, and I don't know about that. I could do Isaiah, but a lot of people do Isaiah, and I think Eric Blanco might be doing one on Isaiah soon. No, I'm good. So we're sticking with Jeremiah. So as we study Jeremiah, there's a lot in here. It's the biggest book of the Bible as far as word count. Bradley literally told Paul. Okay, go, yeah, sure.
Do it again.
Okay. All right, I'll get my mic out.
We don't care, but you should.
Okay. Now it's like the whole right now.
So I have this, we're in here for 6 weeks, and I have it split up in a certain way. We're not going to go through the book chronologically. We're going to go through the book by sections. So we have a day on Messianic prophecy. We have a day on Jeremiah's biography. We have a day on, now they're escaping me. Object lessons, because there's a lot of crazy object lessons in the book. And today's day is actually like the greater context of the Bible. So as I was getting this ready, my dear wife, Nora, said to me, Colby, if you start this Bible study, like, without starting in Jeremiah, I'm just going to roll my eyes. Well, be prepared to roll your eyes. Because today we're actually talking about, like, I'm a high context guy. You might have heard it in my sermon this morning. Like, I need to know everything going on around it so that I can understand what's going on in it. So we're actually going to start at the beginning. We're starting at creation today, and then we're going to get to Jeremiah at the end. So we're going to do a whole, the point of today is I want to show you kind of like there's actually a narrative, there is a story that the Old Testament is telling. Like there is a unified, larger story that's happening in the Bible, and Jeremiah fits in it. So I think a lot of people, when we read Jeremiah, we see the doom and gloom, and we see the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, and we don't really know what's going on. We're just kind of like thrown into it as we read. But there is actually something happening in the grander story of the Bible. And so we're going to hit that today. I'm going to get to kind of what that story is, and hopefully a lot of things about Jeremiah kind of fall into place because of that. So we are going to start here at in the beginning, Genesis 1 through 3. Now, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it happened in 6 days. So if you have a pen, I want you to get it out. That's what the blanket's for. And I'm going to write this up on the board, and I want you to copy it down. So we're going to do, in 2 columns, we're going to do day 1, day 2, and day 3. And on this side, we're going to do day 4, day 5, and day 6. Okay, now, you would think that your pastor would have the Bible memorized, but I did have to look these up. So what did he create on day 1?
Light.
Light and dark. All right, so we're going to write light. What? Okay. Right, okay, separates light and dark. There we go. Okay, day 2.
Waters.
Waters and? We're going to say skies. And day 3? Not quite. Oh, actually, yes, you're right. Sorry. It is land. It's dry land. Sue Gable over here wiping the floor with me. And plants. All right. And then day 4?
The sun and the moon.
Sun and the stars. You might have seen this before, you might have not. Day 5? Yep, fish and birds. And day 6? Yep, land animals. And humanity. Genesis 1. All right, the point here, if we're talking about the grander story of the Bible, and if we're starting here, this is what I want you to see. I want you to see the grand order that God created the earth in. We went from chaos to order. I think I have that word. On the first, up there on the first thing under in the beginning, it says creation, something from nothing, darkness from light, order from chaos. And I want you to circle or star or underline the word order there. So a lot can be made here about, the earth being, only a few thousand years old or whatever. We can talk about that till we're blue in the face. That's not what we're focusing on here. What I want you to pull out of this is the most important thing out of Genesis 1 is the grand and perfect order that God set up when he created the world. It was perfect, it was ordered, with light and dark flowing, the sun, moon, and stars, waters and sky, fish and birds, dry land and plants, and animals and humans, right? They all, this great and grand order that God used to create the world. So that's important as we start. Because then, in Genesis 3, we get the fall, we get sin, right? The imperfection of sin corrupts the perfect. Death and chaos have its day, and kind of the big question of the Bible. So one of the big questions of the Bible is, how do we get back here? How do we get to God's perfect order? How is that going to happen? Well, yeah, we get to through Jesus, right? In the Old Testament, we haven't seen Jesus yet, but so the first question of Adam and Eve is really, how are we getting back to God's perfect order? The question of the church now, we have Jesus, is how are we getting to God's perfect order? We're getting there through Jesus. But the entire Old Testament actually points to Jesus. I don't know if you knew that. My dad does not go to church at all, and he called me up one day and goes, Colby, I have something to tell you. I'm like, what? It's about the church. I'm like, what is it, Dad? It's like, the whole Bible, it's about Jesus. Thank you. Yes, you're right. So it's all about Jesus, right? If somebody has, Karen, I told you we aren't Bible heavy, and we actually are today. If somebody has Genesis 3:15 real quick.
And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her offspring, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Good. Okay. I will put enmity between the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Right. So this promise, in this moment of disorder, as chaos has reigned, the fall has happened. Right. We are no longer perfect. We're trying to get back. How are we going to do it? Not by us. God gives Adam and Eve a promise almost immediately. Almost immediately. And it is your offspring will crush the head of death. Right? Someone from your genetic line is going to crush the head of death. God has a grand master plan now to bring us back to order. All right, and he is starting this, and this is where it starts. It's in Genesis 3 right away. So the word that I'm going to use a lot now is Messiah. You guys all know that word. We use it for Jesus. It's a Hebrew word. It means anointed. Right? Anointed means chosen. There are a few spots in the Old Testament where they actually they use it as a verb and they Messiah things. They pour oil on it. They choose it. But as we are talking about the Old Testament, this word anointed, Messiah, is very important because it tells us about this offspring that God has now called us to look for. Where are we going? What am I doing here now? I wrote all this up, and now I'm not looking at it. Okay, so here's where we're going, right? As we talk about Jeremiah, and as we kind of go through this massive Old Testament day, and as we go forward past this, as you are readers of the Bible and rereaders of the Bible, as Pastor Steve and I want you to be, when we read the Old Testament, we are always looking at it through a messianic lens. That's what I wrote here, right? So we are reading the Bible in light of God's Messiah. We read what happens in the Old Testament because he has promised and given us a Messiah. Right? We can go back into the Old Testament and we can see everything that God has done in Jesus. Right? So as you're reading the Old Testament, the big question that I want you to remember, and if you're reading these sections of Jeremiah, where there's parts I'm going to have you read. If you want to do homework, I do have it on the back actually, or on the last page. If you want to do homework, there's a section where God tells Jeremiah not to have children because all the children in Jerusalem are going to be murdered. Right? He's literally no one will have children and everyone's going to die and they won't have grace. As we're reading that, as we read God destroying his people, how do we read that in the light of the Messiah? What does that mean for Jesus? That's what I want you to get at. As you're reading the Old Testament, as we're going through Jeremiah, that's going to be the big question. It's how do we find Jesus? How do we find God's master plan? Through the destruction and the killing of some of the people that God said were his. How do we address that? The entire Old Testament, as I have written here, it says God's people are waiting for God to reveal the Messiah. God has a grand and large plan to bring the Messiah to earth. And then the rest of the Old Testament is kind of laser focused on this, right? The people of Israel and the people who write the Old Testament and the people who go through all of these things that God sends them through are laser focused on this waiting for the Messiah to come and save them. Which is kind of funny because that's exactly where we are, right? It's just we know who the Messiah is now, right? We are laser focused waiting on Jesus to come back. It's just in the Old Testament, they're laser focused waiting for Jesus to be revealed. So, the farther along that we move in the Old Testament, the more focused we get on who the Messiah is going to be. So right now we're in Genesis 2, and all we hear is that it's an offspring. All right, I have kind of some highlights here of kind of this greater arc that I want to go through. This next section, awaiting a Messiah, these important moments in the Old Testament, I kind of have these big moments that you can find in the Old Testament as you read that kind of point us and move us towards Messiah. right? And again, I want to frame all of this through kind of a Messiah lens because it's going to explain to us why God is doing some of these things in Jeremiah, why Jeremiah acts some of the ways that he does, etc., etc. Because it gets a little confusing, but we'll get there. So, does someone have Genesis 12, 1 through 3? This is the first, Genesis 12 is the first chapter of Genesis where we can start to get a historical record going, where we can actually kind of count back the dates. It's interesting, Abraham's kind of the first guy we can count back to. And God comes to Abraham and he promises him something. So does somebody have that? Raise your hand. Here. You want to take the microphone that is over there.
Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you will all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
Okay. Now I don't have the ESV written. I have the NIV memorized. That's what I grew up with, right? This statement right here that God makes to Abraham is critical. This is one of the biggest moments in the New Testament. All of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. God's grandmaster plan to bring order back has now become a little more focused. Right? He has said to Adam and Eve that one of your offspring will do it, and now he has told Abraham, okay, now actually it's one of Abraham's offspring. Right? We have all of these people going out, and God has now picked one of Abraham's offspring. So the descendant, and now I'm reading off of here, right? The descendants of Abraham now have a special assignment that will affect the fate of the world. Right? Through Abraham's genetic line, the earth shall be blessed. Right? This is God's plan. God has invited Abraham into this. Right? So this is what I said. God has invited Abraham and his offspring. And I want you to make a little note here. Circle Abraham and draw an arrow off to the side and write through Isaac. Right, because Ishmael is not the son of the promise, it's Isaac, but we're not going to hit that too hard. So through Abraham and his offspring, through Abraham, humans participate in God's holy plan for the earth. It's kind of insane when you think about it. And it's a little wild that God has actually invited a sinful human to come and participate in his plan for salvation. But that is how God has revealed himself. That is what God told Abraham. This is how this is going to happen. Now, this is critical. This is so important because we're getting into Jeremiah where everybody's dying, right? All of God's people, all of Abraham's offspring are dying. But we have to remember this, right? That God has a plan of salvation. He has brought Abraham and his offspring into it. And the goal isn't necessarily to save, and we'll get to this in a second. The goal isn't necessarily to save Israel. The goal is to bring the Messiah. Right? So any direct threat to bringing the Messiah to earth is going to be doubled. That's where we're going. So I have in here this little saying, and I don't know if you've ever heard this. It's called the scandal of particularity. And this is a big, it's a term for people who write a lot of books. It makes a comment on the teachings of Jesus and the way that God has acted in the world, right? So that God would choose a certain time and a certain place to reveal his salvation is the scandal of particularity. The fact that God's salvation comes through a particular avenue rather than a universal one, right? So, for instance, why didn't Jesus show up to the Aztecs? Well, the Mormons might say that he did, but we don't, right? So why didn't Jesus appear in the New World? Well, God decided not to do that. God's ways of salvation went through Abraham and Israel, right? And that's how he did it, right? And so it's called a scandal because it's a little offensive, right? We sit there, we can kind of chew on that and be real uncomfortable about it, but at the same time, this is what we claim. This is what we believe, right? This is what we cling to by faith, is that this is what God did. And so we can ask ourselves, why didn't God show up to the Aztecs? Well, that's a little above my pay grade, right? You might look at me and ask it, right? Because you pay me the big bucks. But again, I guess you don't pay me enough. More specifically, the scandal of particularity can be summed up in the words of Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. That is offensive if you're not grasping it by faith, right? For a Palestinian carpenter to say that in 33 AD, 2,000 years before we were born, where we didn't have the chance to go hear him say that, right? That can be hard, right? It's kind of a scandal that God picked the 12 apostles to hear it. He didn't pick us, but we grasped it by faith. So that's kind of that. We can talk about that later if you want, or you can send me an email. Either way. So then we move on to Exodus. So in the greater story of the Bible, right, Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob has 12 sons. They all go down to Egypt. They're enslaved. They're freed by Moses and the 10 plagues. And then they go out into the wilderness in Exodus 24, and God gives them the law, right? So we're getting a little more specific about, like, these people this is the nation from where the Messiah will come. This is the nation where God's salvation will appear. This is the group of people from whom, we will save the world and bring it back to order. This is where we are. This is these people. And so God has some special rules for these people, right? He says, now that we have agreed that, from you, the Messiah will come. The Messiah will be of your genetic line, and, you have agreed to become part of this participation in the world's salvation, we have a deal here. We're going to cut a contract. It's called a covenant, right? And it's Exodus 24, 3 through 11. Does somebody have that? I'll bring you the... You can say it loud.
Yeah. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the new covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven of clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank.
Good. Okay. So Israel has made a contract with God. I don't know if you catch that. They go up to Mount Sinai and they eat with God. They see him. God allows the elders of Israel to see him because they are his people and they are his God. And these words right here are very, very important, especially for Jeremiah. All the words the Lord has spoken, we will do. Is that how it happens? No, that's not. But they do make this contract. They do cut it. This is how they have set it up, right? The people of Israel have come to God, and God has come to Israel and said, okay, this is where salvation is going to come. It's right here. And I have rules for you, because following these rules and we can get into the law a little bit if you have some questions about this. I was going to skim over this, but some of the rules of Israel are made just to make them look different, right? Like, you are a different people. Like the laws that God gives, some of them are like, don't weave clothes of 2 different fabrics, and don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, and like don't eat shellfish and pork. A lot of those like ceremonial laws that we kind of laugh at that the Jews still follow, a lot of those made Israel look different in the world. So that people would say, wait a minute, who are these people? Right? What's going on here? Why are these people set apart in the way that they're set apart? Right? So that's kind of going on with some of these laws. But again, Israel has confirmed and accepted the task that in order to get back to perfect order, in order to get back to perfection, that they will follow God's laws and the Messiah will come to them. Right? So we're still, like, I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record, but we're kind of marching through the Bible, noticing all of these spots where God is saying, okay, no, Messiah, like we're doing Messiah, right guys? You come in, like Messiah's over here. And Israel's like, yep, okay, for a while. So just like we're laser focused on Messiah. And now we know in Exodus 24 that God and Israel have said to each other, yes, Messiah is coming from us. Salvation of the world is coming through us. That's what's going on here. So then we pop down to 2 Samuel 7. If we're going to clip through biblical history, right, they take over the promised land, and we have the period of the judges, which is a lot of fun to study. If you want, I could have picked judges. Oh, could have picked judges. But Jeremiah's fine. We have these judges that come up, and then we have Ruth, and we have this period of like warfare, and then all of a sudden Israel says they want a king, right? And God says, you've rejected me, and they're like, yeah, we have rejected you, we want a king. And then God says, fine, I'll give you a king. His name's Saul. Saul doesn't do too well. And the second one's David. Right? So we have a lot going on with King David. He's a very important figure in the Bible. It's really funny. The first time you meet David, it's the prophet Samuel, and he's going out to anoint, to choose, to Messiah David as king. David's the youngest of 8 boys, and the first 7 boys go past Samuel, and God says, no, it's none of them, it's none of them. And Samuel's like, are you sure? These guys are like real big and strong, they're real handsome, they look like they're going to do a good job. And God's like, no, I don't look at the big, strong, and handsome, I look at the heart. And then it introduces David, and it says, and he was the most handsome. It's like, wait a minute, okay, all right. So that's kind of a funny thing in there. But we have King David. And this moment with King David, and he's called a man after God's own heart, right? God is making this messianic covenant even more specific, right? So we went Adam and Eve, we went Abraham, we went Israel, and now he's going to do it with David. And this is 2 Samuel 7, verses 8 through 17. Does anybody want to read that for me?
Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture for following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in your own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly. From this time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled, you lie down with your fathers. I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him. As I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David.
Good, thank you, John. Okay, now in 2 Samuel 7, this is what God says to David. He says, actually, the Messiah is going to come through your line. The Messiah is coming through David's family, right? I will establish your offspring on the throne of his kingdom forever. Right? And there is actually, it's interesting. The other covenants with Israel and with Abraham, there are stipulations. And they say, it says, if you follow me, you will get land descendants and blessings. If you don't follow me, I will take all of those away. This covenant, this contract that God cuts with David has no stipulations. It is pure promise. This is pure, 100% unadulterated. You will have a king on the throne forever. The Messiah is coming through your line. Salvation is going to be a child of David. And again, just thinking about this, how God brings sinful humans into his world, into his plan of salvation for the entire world. It's incredible. This is a beautiful moment of the gospel where God says, no, like I have chosen you, and you matter to me, and I am bringing you into my plan of salvation. Right? You are participating with me now. Right? So we have King David, and King David gets really big for a few reasons. He sets up the city of Jerusalem, so that's where Jeremiah is the whole time in our book. He establishes the nation of Israel, which we'll get to in a second. And then I wanted to hit this too, because David is not super important in Jeremiah, but it is. Like we'll get there in the prophecy day. But when you talk about Jesus, right? When we go into the New Testament, everything about Jesus actually flows through like this Davidic understanding, right? That like everything about Jesus is offspring of David, sits on the throne forever. Like that Jesus is a descendant of David, and it's a pretty important connection that we make to the Old Testament, like the New and Old Testament. So critical spot here, right? We're getting more and more specific with our Messiah promises, and again, just thinking about like generation after generation, like this, we've covered like 1,000 years in 30 minutes, no, 25 minutes, right? And so just as God's people are just waiting, right? They're just sitting here, following God's commandments, worshiping the Lord, praising Him, just waiting for 1,000 years, right? And these revelations and these promises are getting more and more specific, just like little by little, more and more specific, right? We're coming down the line, and we can kind of see that we are like siphoning in to like this moment where the Messiah is going to show up, right? And we're getting there. Now, in our study, we're not going to get there because we're doing Jeremiah, right? Jesus comes like 500 years after Jeremiah. But I just want, as we're looking at the Old Testament starts to get like just more and more, every little bit of it, just more focus, just a little more focus, just a little more focus, right? So let's flip the page. Or did I have any more? No, yeah, that's it. We'll flip the page of our packet, and we're going to go to 1 Kings 8. We're going to skip the readings here. I'll clip over it real quick. So, 1 Kings 8 is when King Solomon, who is David's son, builds and consecrates the temple. Now, in the church, I don't remember, at least growing up, I don't remember a lot of talk happening about the temple. But I wanted to hit it here because in the book of Jeremiah, the temple is critical. We're actually going to I have a whole session that like built around like talking about the temple and how it affects that. And like in Jesus' day, they had the temple, right? It was the second temple because this one in Jeremiah was destroyed. So we're going to hit the temple real hard because I want to get some understanding on that in our class about Jeremiah 2. But today we're going to gloss over it a little bit. So the temple is built by Solomon. And this section that I have picked for you, it says, the glory of the Lord comes down in like a pillar of cloud and rests on the temple. So they build this temple, they build the house for God, and that is where God dwells. Where do you find God? In the temple. Right? In the book of Jeremiah, where do you find God? In the temple. It's kind of interesting. I mean,
We can ask the same question of us in the church, right? Where do we find God? Baptism, confession, and the Lord's Supper, right? Where's God at? Where's God promised that he will show up? Baptism, confession, Lord's Supper, right? The understanding in Jeremiah's day of the temple was that level, right? Where do you find God? Where does he show up? Where does he promise he's going to be at? In the temple. Right, so the temple is this big moment. And then they start to abuse it because they're like, well, if God's in the if we're actually going to say God's in the temple, then that means that we can do anything, and he's still there, he's still with us. And then Jeremiah's like, no, that's not right. Right, so that's where we're going with the temple day. A little foreshadowing there. But yeah, so Jeremiah and his kingdom, like they thought that they were indestructible because the temple was there, because God like lived there. Right, and there's a whole, we're going to go over it, like I've said. You know, these guys are crying out like, well, we have the temple, and so Babylon's not going to like take us over. And Jeremiah's like, that is so not true, because before the temple we had the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was in Shiloh, and Shiloh is a ruin. So that's fun for them. So then 1 Kings 9 is God's promise to Solomon that like if your people follow my commandments, then like I will establish you forever. Or like something to that effect, and it's foreshadowing because they don't, right? So then in general, so the number 5 there, Israel's sin and the broken covenant, over and over and over again, what I have missed as we're kind of going through this is Israel is repeatedly breaking the covenant, right? Repeatedly sinning against God. They're repeatedly setting up altars and worshiping other gods. And we will get to that too. I want to talk a little bit about like, I get really excited about like Old Testament, like history and stuff. I want to talk a little bit about how religion worked in the day, because religion was tied to like certain places. And so Israel would like walk into Canaan, and they would ask the Canaanites next to them, like, what's the God of this hill? And they'd be like, oh, that's like all of the hill. And they'd be like, okay, let's go worship him at the hill. Right? It was very different than it is today. So they're constantly doing that, right? They're constantly like, oh, who's the God of, this little river over here? Like, they understood gods to be just everywhere, right? And so that's what it means when they're going after, like, foreign gods. They're just, like, they're almost trying to fit in, right? Everybody kind of does that. It's the whole thing. So they're not doing that. They're breaking the covenant. They're doing what was evil again and again and again. And this is the moment. So God eventually hits a point where he says, no, it is time for Israel to be punished. It is time for them to be destroyed. And what I want you to pull out, the big thing I want you to remember from today, is just thinking about this through the lens of Messiah. Because I think if we can think about Israel's sin through the lens of the truth that Jesus is coming, everything else falls into place. Like all kind of this big question about like, why would God kill so many people in the Bible? I think all of that falls into place if you think about the fact that Jesus is coming. Because when somebody or some people group in their sin decides to stand up against God or against his people, they are standing up and against his plan for salvation for the entire world. Right? They are a direct threat to the revelation of Messiah. Right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Right? If you are going to oppose God's plan, you are threatening Jesus. It's a threat. This is a threat to Jesus coming back. Right? Or not coming back, but like revealing himself for the first time. Right? So if the Amalekites came in and like swept over Israel and killed them all, then God has to have a new plan, which he can do, right? God can raise up sons from stones for the children of Abraham. That's what Jesus says. But at the same time, this is God's plan that he's put in place, and he's sticking to it. Right? And so if somebody is standing up and saying, like, no, God, I don't like your plan, they're kind of saying, no, God, I don't want your Messiah. Like, I would actually prefer it if your Messiah didn't show up. And God's not about to have that. He's not about to let a threat to the revelation of Jesus happen in this world. And so when the people of Israel sin, they are actually threatening the revelation of the Messiah in the world. Right? They have become a direct opponent. They are not neutral here, right? Our sin with God is not a neutral thing. We are not like balancing between good and evil, right? When we sin, we are opposing God. When Israel is sinning, they are opposing the revelation of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And God will not have that. And so when we read Jeremiah, that's kind of the flip that I think needs to be made in our understanding, is Israel is actually a threat to Jesus coming back in the way that God has it planned right now. Right? I mean, obviously, like if Israel had survived or whatever and nobody worshipped God, he would have figured out something else. But this was the plan he had, he stuck to it. So, as we read about Israel's sin, as we read about these like nursing mothers who are killed and don't get buried, right? This is like, they are opposing God. This is a direct threat to Jesus coming back. I find that at least somewhat helpful when people ask the question about like, well, why did God have to kill those tens of thousands of people in the Bible? Why did he tell them to go wipe out the Amalekites and not even leave their livestock? Why would God end a human life? Right? That's what we're getting at. These people are direct threats to the Messiah. They're against him. Right, like as I've got written on the bottom one there, right before tangent 1, by rejecting God's reign, they are actively threatening the revelation of the Messiah. Because of Israel's sin, the salvation of the entire world is engendered. Right? Israel turning away from God has put in jeopardy the salvation of everyone. And God will not have it. Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes. I'm going to do a quick history lesson. I gave you some helpful maps on the last 2 pages. I'm a map person and I wanted you to have them. So about 1010 BC is when David starts reigning as king. 970 is when Solomon, his son, reigns and builds the temple in 960. The kingdom divides, right, into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And that lasts about 200 years. In 722, so we're going to talk about 3 kingdoms here, 3 big kingdoms, 3 big empires, right? The northern kingdom, Israel, is destroyed by Assyria. I'm not going to test you on any of this, but that's okay. Then the southern kingdom is made a client state, which is really interesting. If you look at maps and if you look at recordings from the empire of Assyria, you'll get these, they had like a whole formula about how they told the story of how they conquered people. So it'd be like, and I went to Syria, and I grabbed King Og, and I overrun his cities, and I killed all his men, and I threw him in jail. And I went over here to Egypt, and I killed Pharaoh, and I took his cities, and I threw everybody in jail. And so there's like this formula that goes down. And if you look at your map, there's like a little yellow thing around Judah, around the southern kingdom. And it's because as this king of Assyria is listing all the people that he conquers, and it's the same formula every time, right? Like, I took this guy's city over, and I tore his walls down, and I threw him in jail, and it keeps going with that formula like 5 or 6 times, and then it says, and Hezekiah, king of Judah, I kept like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. Like, wait. Okay, so you didn't pull his walls down, you didn't overrun his cities. And so, when you look at the biblical account, the Bible actually says Assyria came through, demanded tribute of the southern kingdom, but did not destroy Jerusalem, right? And we find that actually correct in the historical records that we get from Assyria. So that's fine. And then Jeremiah is actually, like if we're going back to this page with the dates on it, Jeremiah's just left my ministry. Jeremiah's ministry is from about 628 to 580. And he's in the southern kingdom, and it's right at the end of the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom exists for another 150 years or so past the northern kingdom, and they are eventually destroyed by Babylon. So the empire of Babylon rises up, defeats Assyria, and then takes over Jerusalem and destroys the temple. And they're taken into exile in the city of Babylon. In 539, another empire rises up. It was a very hectic time, right? Another empire rises up called Persia. Cyrus the Great is the king, and he defeats Babylon and then allows the Israelites to go back home from their exile, right? So that's kind of we're finishing out the story of the Old Testament, right? And then in 516, the Jews build the second temple that's about, like, if we're looking at dates, that's about the end of, there's a couple other, like, prophetical stories, like, I think Haggai is one of them, and Malachi was written like 400 BC, but 516 is about the last date that we did. That's the second temple's completed, and then the Jews are kind of back in their land. So, yeah, here's some maps. Like, this is Assyria. They were brutally oppressive. Their policy when they took over places is they grabbed people from the land that they took over, and then they scattered them to the wind in other parts of the empire. So when we talk, if you've ever heard the term 10 lost tribes, that was the work of Assyria, where they grabbed the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom and just kind of tossed them away, right? And they didn't really come back. And we're not really sure how Assyria fell to the empire of Babylon, actually, because Assyria was like a crazy, like, just a brutally oppressive, like, nasty bunch of people that, like, had their like administration together, so they're like kind of scary, and then all of a sudden they just kind of like are removed from the historical record, and Babylon shows up. And so we don't really know how that happened, but that's fine. The second map is Babylon. And Babylon only lasts like 100 years, and it's conquered by Persia, but it's this one country that like took over the southern kingdom, right? So they're kind of like a nicer empire, if you can like say that. When they took over a place, they would grab everybody from that place, and then they would actually keep them together and put them like somewhere like together, right? So the southern kingdom, when they were exiled and taken over, were grabbed by Babylon and brought back to Babylon together. So the Jews and the Israelites got to stick together when they were exiled, right? So that's actually kind of critical for God's story, is that when Babylon took over, they kept the Israelites together. And yeah, they lasted like 100 years, and then Cyrus the Great came in and took over. So Israel's political situation, as we like kind of get into Jeremiah, the northern kingdom is gone, right? It's all Assyria. Like, it's just this little tiny little nation called Judah. At the beginning of the book, the empire of Assyria is the main threat, but then they start fighting with Babylon, and so we have this kind of chunk in the middle that where a lot of Jeremiah happens. A relative peace, right? We have these two large empires warring over there, and they aren't really bothered with little Judah, right? So that's kind of that way. And then at the end, Babylon wins out, and they turn their attention back to Judah, because Judah's being kind of annoying to them, and then they take him over. The overall mood, number 5 there, unthinkable disaster is imminent. Unthinkable. The way that Jeremiah describes it, the way that God reveals it to him, it's unimaginable. If we're reading the poetry of Jeremiah, it is brutal and it is bleak. Right? That is what's coming for Israel. And then the people of God will suffer greatly, and yet there are these like beautiful gospel moments in Jeremiah where we talk about the righteous branch of David, the people being settled in their own land. There's an object lesson where God has Jeremiah buy a field in Jerusalem during a siege, like indicating that they're coming back, right? So there is still like kind of this ray of hope in there, and so kind of like into this climate of like unthinkable disaster, where like these massive empires are coming in to take over. God calls this young man named Jeremiah, and we begin our book. So some lessons I want you to pick up from today with 2 minutes left. We always have Jesus in mind when we're reading the Old Testament. Every time, without fail. Every line in the Old Testament you read, I want you to think to yourself, how are we getting to Jesus? How does Jesus fit into this? Like, if we're talking about the Messiah in the Old Testament, where does this fit? Because that's going to be critical. That's how the 12 apostles read the Old Testament after Jesus was raised from the dead. It said they went back and they searched the scriptures and they looked for and they found him. Right? So and that's what we do. We are God's people. We are Christians. We are in a post-resurrection reality, and we read the Bible in light of Jesus. That's what the church does. That's what God has called us to do. That's what Jesus asks us to do too, right? The second one, and we didn't really get this one, but God uses history for his good and gracious will. So it can be a true fact both ways. We can say it is true that Babylon conquered Judah because they were massive and they had way more men and better tactics and a better army. That's true. We can also say that Babylon conquered Judah because God willed it to be so. These things are not at odds, right? God uses people and places and countries in history to do his will. I don't think that's big news to any of us. And then number 3, like Israel, we are people awaiting salvation, right? Everything has changed because Jesus appeared and rose from the dead. But at the same time, there are some things that haven't really changed between us and Israel, right? We are a people who wait. We're a people who wait for Jesus to come back, right? We are a people who wait for perfection, just like Israel. We have also been invited to participate in God's plan of salvation, right? We are the hands and feet of God. Go and make disciples of all nations, right? We participate, like Israel did, in God's plan of salvation for the whole world. Our missional activity is participating in, God's salvific plan. And then the difference here, right, is unlike Old Testament Israel, the Messiah has been specifically revealed to us in the person of Christ. So that was my lesson for today. If you didn't pick up on this, my vicarage was during COVID when everybody had to be spread out and nobody could ask questions. And so I learned Bible studies. I just learned a lecture, right? So if anybody has a question whatsoever at any point, please raise your hand. I'll get it. I kind of needed to push. I wanted to get through a lot of this today. This was a lot of information. I hope it was helpful. Let's pray real quick and then we'll get out of here. Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. I thank you for the revelation of your Messiah, Jesus Christ, your only dear Son. I thank you for the people of Israel and the place that they have in history. I thank you for Jeremiah and your blessed prophets who called Israel to repent from their sins and turn back and follow you. May we also repent from our sins, turn back, and follow you this week. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thanks everyone for attending. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. We'll see you next week.
No, right? I want